Hey everyone, welcome back to the God Project. I am one of your co-hosts, Brian Nicholson, here with my good friend Pete Lash and our new friend David Pallmann, who's going to talk to us today about all the problems with presuppositionalism. So we're excited about that. And I'll let Pete introduce himself, and then David introduce himself, and then we'll go ahead and dive right in.
I'm Pete Lash from Houston, Texas. Interested in philosophy of religion, apologetics, all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much me, and we'll jump right in. Go from there.
David, did you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
For anyone,
My
no,
bad.
you're good.
Oh, you're good.
Anyone who's interested, my name's David Pallmann. I've been on YouTube with my channel Faith Because of Reason. Not real active there, but that's where I've published some of my work, including my criticisms of presuppositional apologetics.
Very cool. So we have some questions prepared. I mean, if there's a brief synopsis that you wanted to give, just to kind of give us an idea of kind of your main positions, we can do that, or we can just dive straight in. Up to you.
Yeah, maybe it's helpful if we give a little overview of kind of what exactly is presuppositional apologetics for starters. And then I don't know if after that you want me to kind of lay out my approach to responding to it, or if you just want to go to your questions from there. But yeah, if I could kind of put it succinctly, I'd say that presuppositional apologetics is basically the idea that in order to know anything, or even to have like any type of rational discourse, any sort of argument, you kind of need to be presupposing God from the start of it. So this particularly comes out when you talk about types of reasoning, particularly deductive or inductive reasoning. That's what we're usually employing when we're having arguments with people. And so the presuppositionalist position is that you don't get to have those sorts of things without God. You have no way to explain those things, no way to justify those ways of reasoning if you're not presupposing. And they're always going to say it's got to be the Christian God. So you have to be presupposing Christian theism in order to justify argumentation in the first place. And so in that way, there's like no way you could even in principle argue against Christianity, because argument itself requires Christianity. And so the way that they proceed an argument then is to kind of exploit that fact and try to turn everything that an atheist or a skeptic of Christianity believes. They're going to try to just turn that against them by pushing them back down to this idea that you can't really make sense of anything unless you have already assumed Christianity. And so I think there's more to it than that, but I think that's kind of a good outline of the system.
Sure, that's great. And then you mentioned kind of briefly explaining how you typically respond to that.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to give a brief response to it, because the nature of the topic is that they want to do a comparison of worldviews. And so if you're going to do battle with a presuppositionalist, then you need to have thought about your own worldview to some extent, because they're going to try to push you on just about every aspect of that. And so it's kind of hard to offer a response to presuppositionalism without taking sides on like a host of really controversial issues in epistemology and metaphysics and things like that. So I give a response from my own perspective. I'm a very traditional epistemologist, or well, that's the study of knowledge for people who maybe aren't familiar with the idea of epistemology. It's the study of knowledge. And so I take a traditional view known as classical foundationalism. And so I sort of defend that as a theory of knowledge. It gives me some common ground with presuppositionalists, because I do agree with them that there's an importance for having certainty in your theory of knowledge, which is something that a lot of people, on both the theist and atheist side, don't want to go to that extreme these days. So that's actually a point of common ground that I have in common with them. But I'm very different in what I think you have as your starting points of knowledge. So for me, this is going to be things like your direct perceptions of things, as well as simple, like necessary truth, something like all bachelors are unmarried men, or something like that. These are sort of the baseline for me. And so then I think we can just build everything up from there, including our methods of inference. So I think we can have justification for believing that deduction, for example, is truth preserving, that induction is at least gives us a reason to believe something is likely to be true. And again, it gets very technical, the discussion, but that's sort of how I proceed. Is I don't like playing the whole worldview games. Like my worldview can beat up your worldview. So I try to avoid that whole way of looking at it and say, actually, yes, you can just build your worldview one piece at a time. We don't have to, compare everything in our worldviews to see who can beat up the other ones. And so that's my general approach.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I know
Good.
Pete's rustled up some questions for you. So go
ahead. There's definitely a few things. One of their biggest things is they have a transcendental argument. A transcendental argument, maybe you could explain, because transcendental arguments, if I'm not mistaken, they're valid forms of argumentation, just in a non-presuppositionalist sense, but it gets hooked into presuppositionalism. So I've heard, especially in your debate with Josh Pillows, I think it was, he's like, well, even secular philosophers agree that transcendental is like a valid way of going about this. And then you responded. So maybe you could kind of flesh that out a little bit and show what a transcendental argument is and where it can be properly used and where it shouldn't be.
Yeah, transcendental arguments are they're real arguments, but presuppositionalists are fond of them. So they're pretty easy to understand what they are. They basically just take the form that something X is a necessary condition for the possibility of something else Y. And so that's going to be your first premise. Then your second premise will say Y, therefore X. So that's the form that they have, is that you need one thing in order to get something else. You have that something else. And so whatever was necessary for it then has to exist. And the way the presuppositionalist tends to parse that out is it's usually something to do with knowledge, and that you're going to need the Christian triune God in order to have knowledge. You do have knowledge, therefore the triune Christian God has to exist. And so that's the form of the argument. But I mean, again, transcendental arguments are used for a wide variety of things. Rene Descartes famously had the argument that I think, therefore I am, right? This is a type of transcendental argument. It's that it's actually originally that he doubts, therefore he is, because in order for him to be doubting, he has to exist. He is doubting, therefore he exists. It's a transcendental argument. Immanuel Kant had famous arguments along these lines for, I think, for free will and morality and things of that sort. And I'm not an expert on Kant, so I'm sure somebody's going to get on me about that later. But Aristotle famously argued for the law of non-contradiction transcendentally. So, I mean, yeah, it's a real type of argument. But in the presuppositionalist case, we'd want to dispute at least that they've given us any reason to think that the first premise of the argument is true, that they're not really giving us any reason to think that God is a necessary precondition for us knowing things. And I should specify that I myself, I am a Christian. So there's one sense I can get on board with this, and that I don't think we would know anything if God didn't exist. But in the same sense that I wouldn't know anything if my mom didn't exist. It's because I wouldn't exist had, my mom not existed to give birth to me, or if God didn't exist to create me. For the presuppositionalists, that's not what they're saying. This is an epistemic thing. So they're actually saying you have to believe that God exists. So more accurately, we might say their transcendental argument is that you have to believe that God exists in order to know anything. And so that's really the very distinctive part of it. It's not just that God has to exist as creator. It's that you actually need God as a presupposition.
Gotcha. Yeah, so they have that starting point, and him and others, other presuppositionalists have often said, well, you start with yourself, and once you start with yourself, you can't. There's no way to get out of yourself. And one thing that I know has been criticized from their side is direct. Let me pull this up. So direct knowledge. Well, let me start with this. So they want to start with God, right? And then have that circular kind of reference point. Okay, let me ask you this. So what's often been mentioned in some of these debates is this concept of public objective certain knowledge. And it seems to be this desire to have, I don't even know quite how to describe it. Even though I've kind of researched it, I don't know quite the definition. Maybe you could flesh it out.
Yeah, I mean, presuppositionalists kind of have their own vocabulary, and that's one of the difficult things about the whole debate is to kind of engage them. You've got to learn their own vocabulary, right. And they can be really like it's like trying to nail Jello to a wall. I mean, if you watch my conversation with Joshua Pillows on this, I mean, I try hard to pin him down on stuff, and he keeps, right. From my perspective, he kept moving, to something else. So it can be frustrating. And so I get why a lot of people don't like to interact with the presuppositionalists. I personally, I have fun with it, but it can be frustrating.
Good.
So in that conversation, when he was using the term, I think that you're, this public, objective, certain knowledge, I'm not, completely sure what he means by it either, because I pushed him on that at one point. I was like, do you really think any knowledge is, objective in the sense that it's publicly accessible? Because knowledge is a species of thought, right? When we're saying that something is knowledge, we're talking about some of our beliefs, right? We have a whole bunch of beliefs. There's some things we know, some things that we believe, right? So knowledge is like it's a species of belief, and it's all a species of thought. And at least, for me, it seems pretty obvious that thoughts are not public objective things that are accessible to anyone anyway. Like my own thoughts and beliefs, those are privately accessible to me and to me alone. So to me, it seems like it doesn't even make sense to talk about objective or public knowledge. That just seems like a basic category error. That's what I tried to pull out with Pillows in that conversation. And I think he even admitted that, oh yeah, thoughts, those are personal to ourselves. So I'm not even sure if he himself is completely clear on what he means by that, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. I was reading that, I was watching that debate, and I wasn't sure what he was trying to convey there. So I thought maybe you had some additional maybe insider knowledge as to what they meant by that, but it's kind of strange. But when we're talking about public objective certain knowledge, there seems to be this desire to want to be like real certain about, like, because he was like, well, you can't know that you're not like in a matrix situation, right? And you were like, well, that's right, but that doesn't negate the fact that I'm having these experiences. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're like, that doesn't negate that I'm having these experiences, and whatever I am experiencing, like I can know that I'm experiencing that, right? Does that make sense? Something like that.
Yeah, so I think I would agree that I can't know with certainty that I'm not in a matrix-like scenario. I wouldn't want to go. So I think we need to make a distinction between knowledge and certainty. So there are some things that we know with certainty. That is when we have justification that's strong enough to guarantee the truth of the belief. And so I would say when I'm having a direct experience of something, I have certainty of that. Even if I'm in a matrix-like scenario that I'm experiencing, whatever it is I'm experiencing, that's still true. So I would say I have certainty about those sorts of things. So where Pillows was trying to go in that conversation is be like, okay, but how do you know that actually is corresponding to, something external to yourself? Now, I'm going to agree with Pillows. I don't have certainty about that. And I would argue neither does he. So there is a point there where I'll go on the offensive at that point, because saying, well, I'm presupposing that the revelation contained in the Bible is true and it reveals to me that there's an external world doesn't help you, because if you're appealing to the Bible, you're appealing to something in the external world, and that's what we were supposed to be justifying in the first place. So I don't think the presuppositionalist has a way out of that. On the other hand, I don't want to say I don't know that there's an external world. So I'll say I don't know it with certainty, but knowledge is a justified true belief, or that's the definition that I would hold to of knowledge. And notice it doesn't have to be certain. So we may not have a guarantee that the truth condition is fulfilled, but I'll say minimally I have a justified belief that there's an external world. That's the best explanation of me having these experiences, is that they approximately correspond to physical objects. That best explains kind of the continuity of our experience. And so in that case, I have justification for my belief that there's an external world. If that belief is true, as a presuppositionalist is going to agree that it is, then I have knowledge of that. So you can't have knowledge even in the absence of certainty. And so I think that's the point I would want to hammer home with a presuppositionalist if we're discussing, brain in a vat like scenarios.
Gotcha. You mentioned direct experience, and I know in other contexts it's been direct acquaintance or something like that. Is that the starting point that you would go from, and what objections have you heard for using direct experience as a starting point for knowledge?
Yeah, so maybe I should explain a little bit about what acquaintance theory is. So I said that I'm a foundationalist before, and most philosophers would be foundationalists of some sort. And all foundationalism is it's the idea that we have two sorts of beliefs, the ones that we infer from other beliefs, and then beliefs which are justified, but not by reference to other beliefs. So if you kind of think about some belief you hold, and I ask you, why do you believe that? And you give me another belief. I can keep saying why. And the foundationalist says that only goes so far. Eventually you hit a stopping point and you have a belief that's going to be justified, but not by reference to some other belief. And so then philosophers who are foundationalists have a whole bunch of theories about how do those foundational beliefs get justified. And so for me, acquaintance theory is how we get justification for those most foundational beliefs. Now, I would say experience is a type of acquaintance. So if, let's just say you've got a headache, right? That's a pretty clear example. If you I would say you're acquainted with the pain. So you can't be wrong about your corresponding belief, right? You're acquainted with the pain. You form the belief, I'm in pain. Everything that makes that belief true is right there in consciousness. So you've got to guarantee that that's true. So I would say that's basically how we get justification for those sorts of beliefs. But acquaintance is not the same thing as experience, because I think we can also be acquainted with something like a concept, right? So if I say a bachelor is a man, right? I'm acquainted with the concept of a bachelor. Mm-hmm. And what's a bachelor? It's an unmarried man. So that belief is justified by definition. And I know that by my acquaintance with the concepts that make up that proposition. So I would say it's not exactly the same as experience. Acquaintance is really just any time that your mind kind of has what would we call an unmediated access to some fact. And so, sorry if this is getting a little technical, but that's the theory in a nutshell.
Gotcha.
And there's a whole bunch of objections to it, and not just from presuppositionalists. I mean, it's controversial even within philosophy more broadly these days. I think most of the objections to it are really bad, at least specifically. So I should say my version of it is a little more nuanced than maybe kind of a simple acquaintance theory. So I say you actually need 3 specific acquaintances to have a non-inferentially justified belief. So think of the components of a true belief, right? If a belief is true, then we mean this belief corresponds to some fact, right? So what you need then to have a true belief is you need the belief, you need the fact, and then you need the two to be matching. They need to correspond to each other. So I'll say you need acquaintance with all 3 of those. You be acquainted with your own belief, right? I believe that I have a headache. You need to be acquainted with the fact that you have a headache. And then you need to be acquainted with the correspondence relation between that belief and the fact that's making it true. And so when you're acquainted with all of those things, then I'll say you can't be wrong, because everything that's making that belief true, it's right there in consciousness before you. Now, an objection to this theory that, say, somebody like Ted Poston, who is he's a coherentist, he make an objection to this called the so-called problem of the speckled hen. He'll give you a situation. It'll be like, imagine you see you have a visual perception of a hen and it's got 48 speckles on it. Well, if you see that, most of us aren't going to be able to form the belief, that hen has 48 speckles, right? It's very complex, and for whatever reason, usually our mind doesn't form the belief. But let's say I do. Let's say I just happen to pick out that the hen has 48 speckles. Well, now it's a true belief, but it still seems like something's wrong there, right? So kind of what's the issue here? And so he'll use that as an argument and be like, yeah, direct acquaintance theory, you can't use it because it doesn't make sense of these sorts of complex explanations. Now, my answer to that is that you only have one or two of the relevant direct acquaintances fulfilled, right? You're acquainted with the fact that the hen has 48 speckles. Let's say you luckily pick the number 48, which happens to be right. You're still missing the acquaintance with the correspondence relation between the two. So it seems like at best, you're only getting two of the acquaintances fulfilled, probably just one. And so that's why I would say that that's not a good argument against acquaintance theory. There's a whole bunch in the literature, but that's a popular objection to it.
Gotcha. What objection is that? Would you say that that's one of the biggest objections you hear from presuppositionalists with regards to direct acquaintance?
Most presuppositionalists have never heard of it, and this is because most of them are stuck in kind of mid 20th century epistemology, and this is because most of them, not all of them, I had a bit of a online back and forth with Dr. Chris Bolt, who is a PhD presuppositionalist. He, of course, had heard of acquaintance theory, but online presuppositionalists, they just don't know about it for the most part. And this is because they're reading Van Til and Bahnsen, who are like these, early and mid 20th century thinkers for the most part. And so they're stuck in those debates. Yeah. And so philosophy's moved along since then quite a ways, and most of them aren't aware of it. So I kind of have fun with that fact. But I mean, when Chris Bolt, for example, responded, so he actually had heard of it, he just used, the same old objections that, that are circulating in the literature today. So he brought up the problem of the speckled hen and such. And so then, then we're just having a debate that's going on in contemporary philosophy, and we're out of anything that's unique to presuppositionalism. As far as uniquely presuppositionalist responses, I haven't really encountered a lot. Like I said, sometimes they'll complain, like Pillows did, that, oh, but it's all in your own head. How do you get out from beyond that? And it seems like they're conceding a lot of ground, right? If they're conceding me the foundations, then I just have to show that I can make an abductive inference to the best explanation that there's a real world there. And if you can't show me that inference is somehow failing, then I've got a justified belief in an external world. So they can make those sorts of complaints, but I just think we've got the resources to answer those sorts of arguments. So I haven't been real impressed with kind of the presuppositionalist response.
Sure. Do you think that if they're willing to concede that an abductive inference can get you to truth, doesn't that kind of ruin the whole presuppositionalist argument? If they're willing, I would say so. Yeah, if they're willing to say, yeah, you can get to truth by an abductive inference. To me, that seems like that'd be maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, they've got two ways they can go, right? They can try to say, oh, well, you don't have any justification for believing that abduction is a truth-preserving inference form. That's going to get us into some deep meta-epistemology. I think we can defend abduction as being a perfectly legitimate way of knowing things, but that's going to get into a thick debate right there. The other way they can go is say, oh, well, yes, abduction is fine, but the inference you're making in this particular case, it doesn't follow for these reasons, and they can go X, Y, Z down those. Sure. Now, here's the problem. If they try to go the first route and say, oh, well, you don't have any justification for believing abduction at all, I can run a parallel argument that's going to land them in the same boat. And this is because even within, let's presuppose the Christian worldview, right? Within the Christian worldview, the world God has created, a mad scientist can still, capture you, knock you out, and, drug you up in a hotel room somewhere and, give you a virtual world or whatever, like the Matrix. So it's not like the presuppositionalist, by presupposing the Christian worldview, has ruled out these kinds of scenarios. they're right. You can't have that on the global scale. Like if Christianity is true, then sure, like the world at large can't be the matrix. But you could personally still be in this kind of situation on the local scale. How are you getting out of that? I don't see a way to do it without saying, yeah, that's the best explanation of my experiences. So if they're going to just deny abduction simpliciter, they've got a huge problem for themselves there, even within Christianity. So
Sure.
that's the route I'm going to go that way. If they want to go the other route, and they don't usually want to, again, burden of proof is on them. They have to give you a better explanation of your experiences. And again, we can apply those same explanations to how are they going to get out of this within Christianity. So I think it's lose-lose for them. Kind of once they've granted you the foundations in direct acquaintance, then I think they really lost the battle at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So they give up. They don't want to do the abduction, but rather have, and I'd introduce this next topic. They'd rather have sometimes circular reasoning. I was kind of amazed by this, but not really, because I'd seen it before in apologetics, that circular reasoning is looked upon favorably sometimes. Like it can get you somewhere. It can get you to truth claims, and it frustrated me when I first encountered it, because knowing that circular reasoning is a bad thing, and then all of a sudden it's a good thing. Like, and we've got to show why circular reasoning is bad, and that it kind of brings us back to square one, in my opinion. I'm not able to cite off the top of my head how the presuppositionalist circular, logic framework goes. Maybe you could kind of fill us in on that, and then also tell us why circular reasoning is bad. Like, why can't it get us to a truth claim?
Yeah, this was my biggest gripe with presuppositional apologetics when I first discovered it. I was in my freshman year of college. I'd kind of discovered apologetics about a year ago. And I was really excited about it, right? I was at a Bible college, and I encountered these people called presuppositionalists. And they're like one of the first things I'd learned is like, oh yeah, we don't want to have like circular arguments. We don't want to like believe the Bible just because it says it's true. And I was like, well, yeah, that makes sense. And then I'm like encountering people who are literally defending that. So I definitely feel your pain on that. Even as a believer myself, I didn't appreciate that.
Sure.
So yeah, in what way is it circular? Well, I mean, you ask. So for the presuppositionalist, I mean, the Bible, that's like that's the highest authority, right, of all things. So you can't justify or prove the Bible by anything else, because that is to give that something else more, in their opinion, more authority than the Bible. So if we're going to, make the Bible the highest authority, then it's improper to try to justify it by recourse to anything else. So if that's the case, we can hit them with the question, so why do you believe the Bible? And things will get circular pretty quick. Well, because the Bible claims to be the word of God. It claims to be true, right? And if you point out it's circular, what's the response? Well, all reasoning is circular anyway. If you push anyone far enough, I mean, ultimately, you all have to go back to a circular foundation. So you can't, that's not a special objection to the presuppositionalists. So the issue here is, first, I want to dispute that all reasoning is circular. And that puts me actually at a minority in contemporary epistemology. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But fundamentally, you could respond to the presuppositionalist on this point by pointing out that they're they're committing an is-ought fallacy on this point. So an is-ought fallacy is when you say, because something is the case, therefore it ought to be the case. So the presuppositionalist would be arguing, because everyone does use circular reasoning, or we can't avoid using circular reasoning, that therefore it's okay to use circular reasoning. And that does not follow. It just doesn't follow that because let's just say that we were stuck in skepticism and that we really didn't have a non-circular way of knowing things. Nothing about that entails that it's okay to use circular reasoning. So the charge still holds. They've still not given us any reason to think that the Bible is true. just by appealing to the Bible. So you've still got the circularity issue. But fundamentally, why is circular reasoning a bad thing in the first place, right? And I should make a distinction here between logical and epistemic circularity. So everyone, even most presuppositionalists, are going to agree that logical circularity is a bad thing. And that's when you've got, your premises leading to a conclusion, and the conclusion is the same as one of the premises in the argument. Of course, it's valid. Circular arguments are valid. The conclusion follows if the premises are true. Why? Well, because one of the premises is the same as the conclusion. So it just trivially follows. The problem is you don't have any grounds for belief. To the extent that an argument is supposed to be giving you more obvious reasons to believe the conclusion, a circular argument fails to do that. Because you just have included your conclusion in one of the premises. And so, yeah, pretty much everyone agrees that's not giving you justification. Now, another type of circularity is called epistemic circularity. I don't think it's much different, but most philosophers today actually do. I'm in the minority in that I don't think even epistemic circularity is a good thing. And a common example here is going to be something like memory. Well, how do you know that your memory is reliable? Well, you depend on, your memory. It gives you this consistent track record of being reliable. And so you can kind of make an inductive argument based on all these examples of a reliable memory that, yeah, memory is a reliable faculty. What's the problem? All of the examples depended on memory. So that's the problem with the inductive argument. And so philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and Michael Bergman, Kenny Boyce will be like, but you're using good inductive reasoning, right? So it's not a logically circular argument. It's just circular because you're, using the source that you're trying to justify, that's playing a justifying role in that inductive argument. My problem is it's got the same issue. You still haven't given us any independent grounds for believing it. So even if you're not, directly including the conclusion in one of the premises, you still have the problem of that you're really just assuming that, in that case, that your memory is reliable. Whatever you're using this epistemically circular argument for, you have just assumed your conclusion. And the issue there is that you can prove anything that way. Right? I mean, I could prove that anything a guy wearing mismatched socks said was true because a guy who was wearing mismatched socks told me that everything he said is true, right? Like you can multiply absurd examples and they're all going to have the same justification. And so that kind of makes our knowledge arbitrary if we go that route. If we say that we can't go, if we can't escape epistemic circularity, then it's got really, to my way of thinking, severe consequences. It would say that none of our beliefs are really any more justified than something as absurd as that, I can believe anything that a guy who is wearing mismatched socks, whatever he tells me, that's true. So this pushes me back to acquaintance theory. Again, I'm not assuming anything because there's this direct confrontation that takes place between, whatever it is I'm acquainted with in my mind. My mind forms a corresponding belief. And if I'm acquainted with that correspondence relation, it would have to be true. There's nothing circular there. So that's why I'm kind of pushed more towards that view in epistemology. Again, that's a very controversial thing, even among just secular philosophers. But I found it helpful in my own conversations with presuppositionalists because I just like to be radical. And in that way, it kind of lets me pull the carpet out from under them because some of them who are a little more philosophically astute will be like, oh, well, this is just recognized in philosophy that, everyone uses circular reasoning. But, I'll know, not all philosophers are on board with it. And I think they have good reasons for why. So it can be helpful even when you're up against a more philosophically informed presuppositionalist to know, even in contemporary philosophy, it's not granted across the board that all reasoning is circular.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've always thought that you were saying you could justify anything. I've always thought that same method could be applied to different religions. Like a Muslim could use that to justify the existence of Allah, and then just name any religion really. I mean, and I know I've seen responses from presuppositionalists about that. maybe you could kind of flesh that out a little bit more.
Sure, yeah. So presuppositionalist. So my friend Eli Ayala, he runs the channel Revealed Apologetics, and he's done more than one video in response to me. But he addresses this issue, and so what he says is he wants Muslims and people like Mormons, people from other religions. He wants them all to use this sort of method to try to justify their beliefs, where you assume your worldview and then you compare it to other worldviews. His argument is going to be that when you do that, when you start playing that game, then he can point out inconsistencies in these other worldviews, how on their own terms, you can't justify them. So a common way that they're going to run this against a Muslim, say, is they'll say, well, the Quran tells you that the Bible is the word of God, but the Bible says things that contradict the Quran. So if the Quran were true, then it would have to be false. And so it's inconsistent even on its own terms, and that's generally how they try to go about refuting other religions. There's a couple issues with it. So for one, you're importing an external standard onto the Muslim there, right? It's like, why does the Muslim have to care about the law of non-contradiction when, it's sort of like assuming that there's this, what they might call an autonomous or neutral standard that you can compare worldviews to. But that's what they were trying to deny. That's what motivated this whole worldview comparison way of doing things in the first place. My response is to just avoid having to go there because I don't like doing it that way. But if that's where they want to go, then hang on, why are you importing all these other standards that maybe they don't accept in their worldview, right? The other thing is you can't really know every other possible worldview out there, every other religion. So you don't really know that Christianity is true. At best, all you could say is it's more consistent than any other worldview I've come across, which is a much weaker claim than people like Van Til and Bonson were making, where they would claim that you could have absolute certainty that Christianity was true in its entirety. And that's you don't get that strong a claim from saying that I've compared it to other religions and they've got internal problems with them. So on the one hand, yes, you could use it for any other religion like that. The presuppositionalist is going to want to respond to that by saying, but look, they've got internal inconsistencies. And so again, you can respond in two ways to that. One, why should they care about internal inconsistencies? And then two, have you really looked at every other religion and know that they all have internal inconsistencies? Yeah. And then if not, then on what basis are you claiming that you actually know that there's not another coherent one out there?
Sure. Yeah. That's always been something that I've thought of. It seems like it boils down to internal consistencies. It's okay.
But what if I don't accept that?
What's that?
But what if my religion doesn't care about internal inconsistencies?
Right. Yeah. Or even there came to be one point in the debate that one of the debates that you were it sounds like you were talking to the presuppositionalists. You were it sounds like what you're saying is if you don't have God in your worldview, you don't have God in your worldview. And you were there's no reason for anyone to account for the, I guess, transcendence of the Christian God in their worldview, right? If they don't accept that, right?
That's the kind of response I use to somebody like Darth Dawkins, who is always asking you let me use his voice. What is the ultimate reference point in your worldview? If you can ever get a word in edgewise, what Darth is basically asking you is, where is God in your worldview? And he's using his own particular definition for it. And what it boils down to is the person doesn't have, if they're an atheist, they don't have God in their worldview. So of course, God's not there in their worldview. And there's some colorful words I'd want to throw at Darth there, but I'll restrain myself.
That's funny. That's awesome. Yeah. Let me see if I have any other questions here. Talked about transcendentals. Okay. One more term that I have a question on. What is autonomous reasoning? And maybe this kind of dealt with direct acquaintance a little bit. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, this is a big word for the presuppositionalists. They don't like autonomous reasoning. And Greg Bahnsen defines it very clearly. So for him, autonomous epistemology is just the idea that you could come to know things that are true without depending on God or on his revelation as contained in the Bible. So basically, anyone who thinks that you can know things without being a presuppositionalist that's what they want to call autonomous epistemology. I don't like that term myself. I used it in the video I did on presuppositional apologetics because honestly, I wanted to piss them off, and I know that they don't like that word. So I titled the video "In Defense of Autonomous Reasoning."
Yeah.
Because I knew that would get a good reaction, and it did. But yeah, that's really all it refers to. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take that label in a conversation with them. I don't think I have to presuppose that God exists in order to know things.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't. And plenty of them are happy to say I'm not a Christian because of that. But like, that's just the traditional Christian perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, not until, to my knowledge, not until Van Til did any Christian ever deny this. So this is like the majority Christian position. I mean, like even in the Catholic tradition, they've always acknowledged that, yes, we can know things. We can learn about God from the world. We don't have to start with God. So, I mean, to me, it's absurd, this idea that you would have to start with God and that it's not Christian to do so, especially.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of absurdity, I know there was one point in one of the debates, the claim was made on the presup side that was basically, if you don't start with God, you're relegated to absurdity. And you were like, hang on, like, have you gone to like, do you have like a ultimate disproof for nominalism? What was the other one? I can't remember the other one, but and it's like, well, are you asking me to, bring refutations of nominalism and whatever the other one was, and you were like, yeah, well, I mean, you're making the claim that you're making this very strong claim, right? So in order to do that successfully, you would need to have these strong refutations of something like nominalism or something else that would account for the laws of logic, right?
Yeah, because precepts love the laws of logic, and they love bringing up the laws of logic, I should say. They don't have any problem violating them when it comes to circular reasoning and stuff. So when it suits them, they don't have any respect for logic. But yeah, they like to bring up that you can't account for logic, or that you can't justify logic. And there are two different things there, by the way. Precepts will use those terms interchangeably. Like, you can't account for this and you can't justify this. Those are two different things, right? Sure. You could be able to account for something even if you had no justification for believing it was a thing, right? So like, I myself, I don't believe that numbers exist in like a Platonic sense. I don't think that they're like is a Platonic realm of numbers. But I could still account for numbers, right? I can still give you metaphysical theories consistent with and that explain the existence of numbers. I don't think I can justify that numbers exist, and that's why I don't believe in them, but I can account for them. Similarly, let's say maybe I don't have an account for something, but there's something I could believe in, right? So let's say, we encounter some fact, maybe some quantum event or something, and I can't explain it. I can't account for it, but I might be able to have very strong justification for believing it. So these are two different categories that presuppositionalists will often combine and say, like, you can't account for logic. So when a presuppositionalist says, I can't account for something, I always ask, do you want me to give you a justification for believing in this thing? Or do you want me to give you a metaphysical explanation for that thing? Yeah. But yeah, when they talk about logic, they're usually assuming like theistic conceptualism. And so this is the idea that like logic is thoughts in God's mind. And so they think of it in like very realist terms, like laws of logic are like sort of these real things that we somehow have access to. My own sympathies are towards a sort of nominalist account or a conceptualist account where like logic is just thoughts and it exists within our own minds. So we're not like tapping into some grand metaphysical dimension of the universe or something like that. So I kind of reject their whole way of framing it. But they will want to say that like your worldview is reduced to absurdity if you don't, take their view on that. And so, yeah, I will say then you need to show that every rival account out there is absurd. And so
Right.
I'm not a Platonist about logic, right? I don't think that there just are these sort of mind-independent laws of logic that inhabit this Platonic realm that's, different from our own. I don't believe that exists. But I don't think that's an absurd idea either, right? Like I have respect for the Platonic tradition. So if I'm going to say that's absurd, I need like a complete disproof of Platonism. I don't have that. I don't think anyone has that. And so, yes, if a presuppositionalist wants to say, if you don't take my worldview, then you're reduced to absurdity, then make them, cash that check. Make them show that there is absurdities in every single alternative. If they can't do that, then they have, they can't make good on their claim.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the more appropriate claim to make on their part when they're making that argument is to say, this accounts for what we see in a better way, I guess. Maybe
but
that's
then they'd have to give up on like all this strong language that the uncertainties, because
Yeah.
then they're coming over to my perspective. I'm happy to say that I think God is a better explanation of certain facts about reality, but that's what an evidentialist does. The presuppositionalist can't go there, so they're in a hard spot.
Right. Yeah. I definitely understood a lot more when I got to that point and started to see that where it like they wanted to say it was absurd, and it's like, well, hang on, if you're gonna say it's absurd, like you have to like you said, cash that check, like go all in on it. But Brian, I don't know if you have any questions. I'm kind of out of questions here, but
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple. Do you think the evolutionary argument against naturalism, as kind of typically laid out by Alvin Plantinga, kind of suffers from some of the same problems that some of these other presuppositionalist arguments make? Or if not, like, what do you think are the biggest distinctions between those kinds of arguments?
Yeah. So I consider Plantinga to be a presuppositionalist of sorts. Now, he's not a Van Tillian presuppositionalist, so there are sort of different schools of presuppositionalism. And I would say that actually in one of his books, Plantinga mentions Van Til and says that Van Til doesn't make any sense, and it's a pretty good quotation from Plantinga. But I would consider Plantinga to be a bit of a presuppositionalist. And so there are similarities, I would say, between his evolutionary argument against naturalism and a kind of Van Tillian transcendental argument. Now, what I think the main difference is that Plantinga is at least kind of tentatively willing to extend the naturalist and olive branch. Like in theory, you could have a warranted belief in naturalism, but it's only when you introduce the content of this belief that you run into problems, because he's going to want to say you don't have any reason to trust your cognitive faculties because you don't think that they were designed for any purpose. And so that's where you sort of get this internal self-defeat problem that Plantinga is going to want to argue for. His argument, in my opinion, is very heavily dependent on his overall theory of warrant and proper function. And as I mentioned, I'm a classical foundationalist. He's not. We both are kind of on polar opposites of the epistemological spectrum. I'm a staunch internalist. He's a staunch externalist. I don't think his argument really works unless you're kind of bought into his overall theory of knowledge. Because Plantinga, he's a Reidian, right? So he thinks that you just sort of start with the beliefs that you have, and you more or less you assume those, right? Whatever beliefs you have, you just find yourself believing things. Then you only reject a belief if you encounter negative evidence against it. You don't have to have positive evidence for your beliefs, according to Plantinga. He doesn't think you can do it. So that's very different from my perspective, where I say, no, you need positive reasons for your beliefs as well. So for Plantinga, we're starting out with the beliefs we have, right? For him, he starts out with the belief that God exists, right? And until you can bring some objection, some defeater to that belief, then he's warranted in holding it. And that's kind of what his career was spent defending, that basic idea. So if you buy into that theory, then maybe there's some force to his argument because he gets to just assume his beliefs. and maybe the atheist just gets to assume his beliefs, and then I can be like, oh, look, but here's a belief that you have, which implies at least that you shouldn't be able to really hold these other beliefs. From my view, it's hard for that to get motivated, because I say you need independent reasons for believing the beliefs that you have in the first place. So then you can't just point to a belief and be like, oh, that implies that you shouldn't be justified in your other beliefs, because I am justified in those other beliefs. So that's why I'm not a big fan of Plantinga's argument there. But if you're asking about, are there similarities with a presup argument? Yes, I just think Plantinga's is he's willing to extend the olive branch and say, yeah, atheism could be justified, whereas the presuppositionalist is kind of more hard line and saying, like, no, you couldn't even in principle be justified.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I'm not sure how familiar you are with presuppositionalist arguments made from like Muslims or Mormons, but I was wondering if you could maybe just kind of explain what are some of the key differences between some of the major world religions when they argue from a precept type position.
Yeah, I haven't heard a whole lot from people outside of Christianity. I have heard that some Muslims have kind of picked up a presuppositionalist take on things. And again, I just think the arguments I would have against Islam are going to hold either way. I do know, though, that within different sects of Christianity, they kind of adapt it differently. So presuppositionalism tends to like really thrive in the Calvinist, Reformed Protestant tradition there. And I'm already not well liked in that community because I don't have a lot of love for Calvinism in my heart. But I love Calvinists. But yeah, Calvinism is
a topic for another podcast.
You're right. I won't go off on Calvinism today. But
no, I said it's a topic for another podcast.
Oh yes, you're right. Yeah. But let's see. Where was I going with that? Oh, yes. But like Jay Dyer, for example, would be like an example of someone who's Eastern Orthodox and has tried to like co-opt presuppositionalism to his Eastern Orthodoxy, which is funny because, the precepts will try to say, at least the Calvinist ones will try to say, oh, yes, this is a Calvinist apologetic. You have to be a Calvinist to use it. And I mean, I've never seen that. I don't see any like connection between a Calvinistic theology and presuppositionalism. I think they're both false, but like for completely independent reasons. And so somebody like Jay Dyer will come along and will like try to use it for Eastern Orthodoxy. And it doesn't seem to me that he's, being a whole lot different. I mean, he might be being ruder than some of them, but he's not like being any different in the terms of the argument that he's giving. So at least to me, that seems to prove that it really doesn't depend on any one religion. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but
no, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And then I might have one other question after this, but are there any prominent precepts that change their views and are now evidentialists, or have you interacted with any that ended up changing their mind, and what were some of the reasons they ended up changing their position?
A friend of mine, and I don't know if he's really well known. His name is Jason Peterson. He had a website for a while. Actually, when I was also when I was in my freshman year of college, he was still a presuppositionalist then, and I didn't really know he was at the time, but I kind of discovered he was through some of his answers. I would just send a lot of my questions to his website, and that was kind of how I got to know him. He's just recently abandoned presuppositionalism. So this will probably get Jay Dyer upset, but he says his reason for leaving it was because he became Eastern Orthodox. So, Eastern Orthodox is just very big on tradition, and no matter what the precepts say, if you look through church history, sorry, you don't find presuppositionalism there. But so, I mean, he is probably the most prominent example I know. Again, he wasn't like a really big name, but he was, he had a book out there that he had defending it. He had a website. He'd even done it in debates online a few times. So he was known in the, at least online presuppositionalist community. And he has, I don't think he'd consider himself an evidentialist now. I think he would probably just say he's a traditional Orthodox Christian, but yeah, he's probably the most prominent example I know of somebody who has stopped being a presuppositionalist.
Sure. So it kind of sounds like presup as we've laid it out today, or as you've laid it out today, ultimately boils down to assertions. And I'm wondering if that is the case, like if it could even really be called an apologetic, because it seems like apologetic depends on like reasons and arguments. So I was wondering if you would agree with that.
I think in practice, a lot of it is just assertions. But I think that there is an argument there that they're making. I don't think it's a successful argument, but ultimately, like in theory, sure, like you could make the transcendental argument that you need God as a presupposition in order to know anything else, and then argue that effectively by showing that people don't, in fact, know anything unless they were to adopt that sort of theory of knowledge. So I do think that there is a real argument there, and I think it's a flawed argument, to be clear. I don't think it's successful by any means, but I do think there is more than the mere assertion. Now, in practice, it's often played out as just bare bald, strong assertions because I think they like that. Frankly, I think this is an apologetic that was designed, for people who were in the faith to keep them confident in the faith and to discourage them from, ever having to worry about that they might be wrong. That's, my kind of personal opinion of why this apologetic, if we can call it that, exists. But yeah, I would say that because there is an argument there, we can say it's a sort of apologetic. I'm okay with calling it that. I don't think it's a good one. I don't think it's an effective one. It's one I'm going to discourage Christians from using as much as I possibly can. But I don't think it's fair to say it's just assertions.
Sure. Well, thanks. That's it for my questions. Pete, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. It's been great having you on, David. Been a good time.
Yeah,
Yes.
loved it, man. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. We will talk to you later.
All right.